Hello, everyone, and welcome to that 90s Witch. I am Trace, and I am super excited to introduce you to a good friend of mine and just all around magical person, Christopher Penczak. Christopher Penczak is the author of over 20 books of witchcraft and magic, co-founder of the Temple of Witchcraft, where he continues to serve as a teacher and a minister, high priest of the Cabot tradition of witchcraft, and frankly is a pillar of several magical communities. Christopher also writes a wonderfully insightful and rich blog on templeofwitchcraft.org, where he shares his vision of an evolving witchcraft culture, making magic accessible to all, yet preserving the heart of the mystery. Welcome, Christopher Penczak, to that 90s Witch.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you're here. So, Christopher, I know we've known each other for a long time, and I think that we probably met 2006, 2007, somewhere around there. And that was really only a few years after you had started becoming a published author. And so I kind of wanted to even rewind the clock a little bit and hear about your story, your experience becoming a witch in the 90s, discovering witchcraft, and then becoming a witchcraft teacher in the later 90s.
I'd be happy to share all that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess when I started in the 90s, I was actually graduating high school in 91, taking me back there. And I had a friend who was my art teacher from when I was 7 to about 16, 17. And this is the part that people have a really hard time understanding today. It was back in the days where, like, if you were a witch, you didn't tell people. And you were
Right.
afraid you'd lose your kids and you're afraid you'd lose your job and everything. And really, my teacher said she didn't tell me, she waited to tell me till she was 18, until I was 18, because it was the threat of corrupting a minor. But
I
as
was
soon
in
as
the same boat. I had the same scenario. Yeah.
yeah, so as soon as I turned 18, she's just like started dropping these little hints around. And then finally, maybe 6 months after I graduated, she's like, "You get it, right?" And I was like, "Get what?" And we talk about art and Celtic history and mythology and Egyptian hieroglyphs and all the artsy stuff that we were both into. She's like, "You get it?" And I'm like, "What's there to get?" She's like, "I'm a witch." And I just thought that was hilarious. Like, I never knew anybody could be a witch. I thought it was just something, I loved wizards and Dungeons and Dragons types of stuff, but that was all very fantasy in my mind because I didn't really think people could be that. So she sort of blew my mind that she was living as a witch, and she started to point out things in her house that I'd been over a million times. And she's like, "Here's my crystal ball." And here's, it was even back in the day where you didn't have a temple room to close. So things were scattered around her living room. And then when she wanted to do all
Wow.
of it, she would just kind of gather it all together. So you could see all the bits everywhere and how she would hide it. So it was fascinating.
Mhm.
Although I also thought it was sort of crazy,
Yeah,
so,
yeah. Like, why is
right,
she
like,
hiding all this stuff?
yeah,
Right.
exactly. And so I was like, is this real? Like, have you lost your mind? Have you joined a cult? That was really, end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. So it was the whole satanic panic type of thing. And I was like, is she joined a cult?
Absolutely.
My help? Like, so arrogant. I was 18 and I don't even know how old she was at that time, but I was like, I'm going to save you. And so she's like, well, before we talk about it, read this book and just tell me what you think. And she gave me, I think the first book was The Holographic Universe, or it's actually Stalking the Wild Pendulum. She's all about
Oh,
quantum,
yeah.
you know? And then I was like, all right, let's talk about this. I don't know why you wanted me to read that, but okay. And then she's like, well, read this other book. And she gave me The Kabbalion.
Hmm.
And I was like, all right, I'm ready to talk now. And she's like, no, read one final book and then we can talk. And it was Power of the Witch by Laurie Cabot.
I was about to say this sounds like the opening Laurie Cabot curriculum, right? Kind of
Exactly,
going on here.
exactly.
Yeah.
And that
Uh-huh.
was her teacher. So
Mhm.
she's like, now that we have vocabulary, we can talk about it. And by the time we were done talking, I was like, all right, you haven't joined a cult. I think you're okay. I still think this is a little crazy, but I want to know more. And so she taught me to meditate. She taught me how to do tarot. She gave me my first gig as a professional tarot reader. She used to run these big psychic fairs. And one of the readers fell out at the last minute. She's like, go sit that table. And I was like, okay, to do what? She's like, you're the reader there. And I was like, what? So my first professional reading gig was 8 hours straight of reading strangers off the street.
Oh my gosh, I love that.
By the end of it, I was like, okay, I can be a professional reader. Sure, no problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
Trial
just
by fire.
she invited me to her. I never joined her coven, but she invited me to her coven, and I and my mother was a guest of her coven. I think the coven, looking back on it now, probably was going through its own metamorphosis, so it wasn't really time for outsiders to join at that time. But once I hit a certain level of asking questions that she thought were really complex, she's just like, I should take you down to Salem and meet Lori. So I went to one of the Sabbats. I think the very first one was the crazy Samhain Sabbat of the 200, 300-year anniversary of the witch trials. And then she,
Wow.
yeah, so it was like film crews. It was crazy. That was my first Samhain. But then we got to go to a Beltane after that, and she took me aside and introduced me to Lori, and she's like, she's doing classes soon, and I started taking classes with Lori, and that's really how I fell into it over this whole time. So it's crazy.
Yeah, I love that story because I feel like it really encapsulates what I've heard from other people who came up as witches in the 90s, just in terms of the absolute lack of actual witch representation at that time. Like it was out there. Obviously, things were going in the 60s and 70s and 80s, but still in the 90s, unless you knew where to look, you didn't know if any of this really existed, right? Like there was an inkling for it. There was still a big belief that witches weren't even real. And so you couldn't even be a witch, right? And then you spoke about the Satanic Panic, and I can relate to that as a teenager in the 90s, being interested in witchcraft. I wanted it so bad. I was so interested in it. And yet I always was very paranoid's not the right word, but always like looking to make sure that it wasn't like a we actually are this crazy satanic cult, right? You know, it's so and so there was always this part of me that was like, maybe this really nice middle-aged lady who's sitting here talking to me, like maybe she is that, but like I don't know. I'm going to keep my eyes open, right? And so like there's a little bit of that fear connecting with kind of anybody, especially with all that background noise of the Satanic Panic, which was kind of everywhere. That was more represented than I would say even Laurie Cabot or the film crews that were filming like your Samhain celebration, for example. Like that was just starting to come out in a wide way in terms of mass media in the 90s.
Yeah, this is way before any of the TV shows of Charmed and Sabrina and, you know,
Right.
and all that type of thing. In fact, my elders were really shocked when those shows came out. Like they couldn't quite believe people were sharing things or talking about it in that way. But to go back to the Satanic Panic, I didn't realize till about 10 years later. So part of this whole journey is my mom became a witch the same time I did. And so I was raised uber Italian Catholic, and, you know, from first grade all the way through confirmation, Italian Catholic, you know, high school, and the only public school I've ever been to is college. And she was like, "Oh, I'm kind of interested in what you're doing. What you're going over to Lynn's house. I'm going to come over for the full moon. Yeah, can I come to that?" And years later, she goes, "Oh, you know, I was doing that, right?" And I was like, "Well, why?" She goes, "Well, I thought, you know," she's like, "I was fine with when you were with Lynn, and I knew her for years and everything. But when you started taking these lessons from this crazy lady in Salem and going to all these people I didn't know, and, you know, she's just like, I came along just in case, because I was like 18, 19 at the time. She goes, I knew if I forbid you from doing it, you'd want to do it all the more. So she goes, I sort of at first faked interest so I could know what you were learning. And then I'd be right by you in case they like pulled out the goat to sacrifice or a baby to sacrifice or something. She's like, we're getting out of there." And I was like, "Oh, well, what happened for you?" She goes, "Well, after hearing all the teachings, I decided I wanted to be this more than be Catholic." So she gave up her Catholicism. My first coven was me, her, and a woman she sort of adopted to be like my sister. That was a part of our spiritual family. And that's how I got my kind of personal practice. So it was my mom and my sister and I. Yeah.
How fortunate is that? Like that seems just like a really ideal dream scenario for a lot of people, especially even in the 90s, right? Feeling alone. I know I felt really alone in the 90s as a young witch. My parents certainly were not into this. It was something that I had to hide, very, very specifically hide. I would go to the bookstore, ride my bike down to the little bookstore, probably, you know, 15 years old or something like that, and go hide my books in the bushes and wait for them to go to sleep, and then go out and retrieve my books and bring them back into the bedroom, right? And so I very much love that story because I think it's so important to know that not everybody was alone and not everybody's parents were opposed to this, right? Or not, or even if not just accepting, but embracing of this.
Yeah. My dad thought it was a little crazy at first, but he was willing to go on with it. And then as time went on, you know, he was just like, okay, this seems a little too, like you're getting too into this. So he's a little nervous about it. And then he needed a spell. And so we did a spell for him. And immediately the next day, and he's like, all right, this is okay. So he had a gentleman he was working with who at the time was his boss, he thought was out to get him. And we did a binding for no harm, but a binding so his boss could not do harm for him. And the very next day, they got transferred to different departments.
Oh, wow.
And he was working together for years. Yeah, when ended up working together for years, came back together at the same level, and they became friends. So like he knew we didn't do any harm because we didn't hurt anybody, but he was just like that worked immediately, very next day. And he's like, all right, there's something to this witchcraft stuff. And so from that point on, when we traveled to a different city, or if we're gonna do a little day trip, because I was still pretty close with my parents all through college, we'd like check out the local occult store. So I remember us being in Texas, of all places, in El Paso,
Mm-hmm.
Texas. And my dad was working out there, and we went out to visit him for a couple of weeks, and he found the little occult store that was like, the old kind of not quite Botanica, but not quite
Uh-huh.
New Age store. It was sort of where and people don't realize, like, today, having so many shops to go to, like at that time in the 90's, one shop served the witches and the Wiccans and the ceremonial magicians and the Satanists and all the African traditional spiritual
That's
religions,
right.
all the hoodoo traditions, and any of the weird things was all under one shop. So there's a lot of crossover. Like, I learned a lot about like 7-day pullout candles because, that's what was at the shops.
That's right.
No.
That's right. So shops definitely were a huge community focus in the 90's. And I know that we have a lot more shops today, and there is a little bit of that going on, with community meeting around stores. But in my experience, the 90's, they were true community centers. Like the shop was the commerce element was just to create the brick and mortar because the focus was community.
Yeah, they were the
It was
hub.
to serve people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, often stores were run by covens, or they were
Hmm.
owned by the high priest or high priestess of the local coven, and that was the kind of their public face and their outer court, and it was a way you could actually have an experience.
Yeah. So you became a witchcraft teacher in 1998, correct?
Yeah, I started unofficially in 97, but it's not declared on my taxes till 98.
Yeah. We'll
That was,
edit that out for the IRS people.
that was a
Yeah.
lovely conversation with my accountant.
Yeah. Yeah, you became a witchcraft teacher then in 97, 98. And that was you, and you had mentioned earlier about your teachers being shocked at the level of media that started coming out about mid 90's, with some genuine, if not definitely Hollywoodified representation of witchcraft, but it started to really come out in a way that had never happened before and in a amount that had never happened before. And then you were a teacher, and then you must have already started writing and have been on this path to becoming an author in the early 2000s. So what was that transformation like for you as somebody who was skeptic, became a witch, started teaching on the path of publishing, and then this whole world changed?
Yeah, it was really interesting. And I have to say, I'm 50 now, and looking back on it, I understand in the wave of TikTok and Instagram and everything what my elders were complaining about in the 90's. I sort of get now, like,
I feel that.
and I also know in the 90's it was such a blessing for me. So I also know how things that I might not resonate with today are such a blessing for people today. So
Hmm.
I've got to balance those two views out. But it was weird. I remember talking with some folks in the covens and the groups and the centers that I was at, probably mid 90's, and they were just shocked at the craft, and they were shocked at some of the stuff in Buffy. And it was the weirdness of half being happy because it was so prevalent and you could talk about it. And there's just enough in it that you're like, that's familiar. That's not what we do. And obviously it's sensationalized and everything. And we joke, as I still do today, because people are like, oh, you should do a reality TV show. I'm like, if you really saw what we're doing, like truly authentically, you'd be bored out of your mind. Like, it's just living life. It's not lightning bolts from your fingertips, but
The
uh,
original cottage core. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like, I think sometimes the level of change, or sometimes the level of entertainment to it, also bothered my elders. And as
Mhm.
it grew on, I was like, I understood after having many a public class, because in the 97, 98, 99, I was teaching publicly in shops and doing things like that. And you'd get folks all into the 2000s like, oh, I'm like, in Buffy, I'm like Willow, I'm addicted to magic. I'm like, yeah, it doesn't really work that way. Like, you might be addicted to power, but if you're trying to do that through witchcraft, you're probably going to go more crazy than, actually have power and become addicted to it. So it's hard to have those conversations because people got really set in their minds. They saw something
Yeah.
on TV, and that's the way it was. And I must be lying, even though I'm the teacher of it, because the TV wouldn't lie to them. I feel that I sometimes deal with that, like on Instagram as well. I saw how to do a spell this way on a reel. You know, I'm like, yeah, that was sped up and that was super fast. And if it only took you 2 minutes to do the spell, then you probably didn't do it very well. And like, no, that's not true. They're super and they're quick and they're easy. And like, okay. Yeah, so it was a weird transition for that, you know, and seeing that grow. I liked it at the time, but being younger, I just loved seeing it in media. I'm a big comic book geek. I'm a big, you know, into kind of the alternative scene of things. So to see it in music, to see it in comics, to see it in literature, besides the TV, and that was a little bit more close to what we're doing, or it was a little bit more authentic. I was like, oh yeah, I get that. Like I remember, as strange as it is, and this is probably maybe published in the 80s, but I didn't read it till the 90s, Anne Rice's Witching Hour.
Oh yeah, yes.
Although that had nothing to do with Wicca, you know, when she describes psychic healing and how she visualizes the, you know, the blood vessels and whether she used it to harm somebody or heal somebody, whether it burst or whether it's sealed or all that, I was like, oh yeah, that's what I do when I heal. Like very familiar reading that. Whether Anne Rice thought that or not, I don't know. But so it's little things like that I thought were interesting because they were able to get people to understand in the mainstream a little bit of what we do. So sometimes I could say, you know, it's sort of like this, but not exactly. As the boom started to come, it was like the publishing was kind of crazy. And so people don't also understand, like, you know, when you're talking about riding out to the bookstore on your bike and hiding things, like it was before the big box stores. Like I remember when the first Barnes and Noble opened and had like a whole witchcraft, magical, mystical studies section. That was a huge deal.
Yes.
Before was like I remember having to go into Boston, take the train into Boston to go to the Walden Books to find the occult section hidden underneath the stairs, and there was 15 books and a
Yeah,
one
this big. Yep.
Bible, you know, and you had Paul Husson's Mastering Witchcraft, and you had a couple Starhawk, Stark Cunningham, Ray Buckland, and that was it. You know, and a couple kind of crazy out there spell book types of things, and it was really tough to find something new or something helpful. And then
Yes.
you have all these bookstores starting to open up. And I'd say like late 90s, early 2000s, people started doing like meetups in the cafes of the stores. And I
Yes.
many a time did a little book signing type of thing in you know, Barnes and Noble or Borders Cafe. And you had much wider selection because all the publishers were putting out more things. And even though they were putting out things all along, like you could find them in the suburbs now. You could find them without having to go
Right.
to a cult shop or the big city. Yeah, it was crazy.
That is crazy. And you know, it also makes me think it's publishing, it was like television, movies, visual media, but then obviously we got to also talk about the internet,
Yes.
right? In terms of how that changed things and how that impacted all of the above. So what would you say, what was the role of the internet for you, both as a up and coming witch, as a teacher, as a publisher? Um, how did the internet impact your practice or the way you connected with people?
It became really vital over time. You know, you went from doing, like I would joke before all of this and before I started dedicating my life and my profession to this, my background was in music. And so I did
Mhm.
jokes when I was in a band, I was making flyers, I was booking gigs, I was on tour. And for a while in the 90s, I was making flyers, I was booking gigs, I was, you know, on tour to metaphysical stores and things like that. And then with the internet, like particularly the Witch's Voice, all
Mhm.
hail the Witch's Voice, because it, you know, had state by state listings and it listed groups, it listed events, it
I
had
love the era of the witch's voice.
yeah, Fritz and Ren and the whole staff there. They're really, really amazing people. I knew them personally and really just loved all of their dedication to all of that. And so advertising my classes there and advertising, finding shops to teach through the Witch's Voice, advertising my classes, that was a huge part of, if you want to call it a marketing plan, my marketing plan at the time.
Hmm.
And it was really a great way. A lot of people found me to do weddings, found me listed
Wow.
as a minister there, or you know, the first time I got called in to do, you know, a kind of care for somebody in a hospital because they were crossing over and dying. Somebody found me, one of their family members found me through the Witch's Voice. So
Wow.
it's really, you know, for ministerial work, for teaching work, for community work, for meeting pen pals and you know, things like that. It was really pivotal for me in researching gay witchcraft. So
Mm.
when I started writing, like my first book was City Magic, and it was just trying to take what I knew when I was working in the music industry in Boston and trying to figure out how to practice witchcraft while I was in the city 24/7. And that was sort of a notebook turned into a book. And at that time, I was doing the class notes that would become the Temple series. But on the side, I was really researching, you know, all the kind of queer mysteries and a lot of what became the first edition of Gay Witchcraft, just because I was so flabbergasted when I came out into non-Salem, Massachusetts community and my elders, excuse me, that were out there. Because the Cabot tradition's not really gender-based, and although we talk a lot
Right.
about polarity and gender in terms of hermetics. There's no rules of high priest, high priestess. It's not a big sexual mystery. It's much more about the mystery of inspiration and Awen and things like that. So once I got out amongst more, and I knew about Gardnerian Alexandrian stuff for my studies, but meeting kind of hard guard folks was a shock to me. And people telling me to my face, so you can't be a witch because you're queer, or you can come to our circle, but you have to act straight in the circle. I was like, what does that mean? Like, are we having sex in your circle? Because I don't want to come then if that's what we're doing. And you never knew in those days because that it could likely have been that, so you always had to ask good questions. So I started really trying to research, well, what are our mysteries? And luckily, I was traveling a lot to New York and to Boston, so there's queer bookstores, and you start to see some of the mythology and some stuff from the radical fairies and all the stuff that people have access to today and the history they have access to today. It was like little scant nuggets you'd find in like a bookstore or talking with somebody or a new zine or all these kind of magazines that came out at the time that people were selling. And so the internet became a great way for me to meet people who were queer, who were practitioners, for them to share ideas. That's how I met Storm Fairy Wolf. We've started talking way before either of us wrote books, and he'd share some of the things from his practices. And so it's just a really great way to know what I was researching. I wasn't alone, and there was many paths and many practitioners trying to figure those things out.
Yeah, wow. I mean, how vital, yeah, definitely vital, the internet for being able to connect you to all these other queer witches and pagans. I remember this was not in the 90s. This had to be in the about like 2006 or 7 or something like that. But do you remember a website that was called Pagan Men for Men?
I do remember that, yeah.
And it was supposed to be sort of like this like gay pagan dating site or whatever. But the funny part about it is that there were never almost anywhere enough gay pagans in your area to actually meet them, right? And so, or who, at least who was on this website. And
Right.
so the reason I bring this up is because I can imagine how important it was for you, because that connected me to other gay pagans in a way that I had never had access to before. I met people I never would have met otherwise. And because we were kind of so dispersed for a while, that how else would you have known? How else would you have connected? How could you have written a book called Gay Witchcraft without knowing what was going on in the wider world of gay witchcraft, right? So, yeah.
I will interestingly say the intersection of that with my experience, like Salem, Massachusetts, was such a hotbed of people on the outside. It wasn't just witches. So my first Witchcraft 1 class with Lori Cabot was the first time I actually met other gay people. I was still in the closet. I was there with my mom. I wasn't out to her. I was 19 probably at the time. And the first gay man I met was in that class, and the first lesbian I met was in that class. So it was really, and to see Lori so welcoming and to realize this was a religion that did not matter, that was never brought up. I made the assumptions. We befriended the woman, the lesbian, later on, and she shared a lot about her life and her practice and her sexuality and how that intersected with her magic and everything. But it was just such a non-issue that would be a barrier in any way, and that sort of prepared me. It's so weird to think I came out as a witch before I came out as a gay man, but it's sort of need to be able to have those conversations with people.
I had a similar path. I knew I was a witch before I was knowing, or at least enough to say I was gay, right? And so I definitely I feel that too. And I also was really accepted by the people that I met, my first teachers, and I had no idea that there was really any sort of issue with that in witchcraft until I started, like you, meeting other people and reading more widely. And really, it wasn't even reading more widely. It was usually just the one-off person who had a problem. But I was deeply, deeply accepted when I first came out as well by my teachers and my mentors. Christopher, on a personal level, did you have a favorite AOL chat room or Yahoo group that you went on to talk to witches, or to just pen pal or anything like that?
Believe it or not, my favorite thing, there was a Yahoo group that wasn't for witches, but it was my favorite spiritual group. It was a group for light workers, believe it or not.
Okay.
And for a while, I got kind of sick of the chatty bitchiness of witches. So it's
Yeah, well,
more that things stay the same. And it was just really, and I think because I was less familiar with that world, and it was sort of an ecumenical, all spirituality, they welcomed me as a witch, but I was the only witch there. Some of them were very Egyptian based, some of them were very Reiki based, some of them were very alien based and angel based and all sorts of things. So I got exposed to a lot of different things. I had some really great conversations. And I think it was just called light workers something. I can't remember. Light
Mm.
workers for us, light workers for you, something like that on Yahoo. And I had a really, really great experience. I had some friends, met some of them in the flesh as I started traveling and touring with the first books and everything. So I met some down in Arizona, met some down in Texas, met some down in California. And it was really cohesive and a really good group. I was sad when it kind of fell apart. We had one strong personality that sort of dominated at the end and sort of drove us all away, which, story as old as time.
Exactly. I was about to say not uncommon, not uncommon at all. I kind of want to ask you two questions around that too, because we're talking about connecting and this broadening and the shows and the publishing and all of these things, and you kind of being right in the middle, in the center of this, at least in one stream of this happening. And I'm kind of curious about what you see as like the main differences between witch culture in the 90s and witch culture now, especially as you have this vision of a future witch culture. And yeah, let's start there.
Yeah, so I would say in the 90s into the early 2000s, it was fragmented, seeking to come together. And now I'd say it's fragmented, seeking to grow further apart.
Wow, that's a statement. Okay, can you say a little more about that?
Yeah, so I think in the at least from, and it's all from my perspective. So I think if
Yeah.
you were just coming into it now, you might see it differently. But as I observe it, I think at the time in the 90s and early 2000s, having so few of us, even though it was growing and momentum was building, there was still this sense of us against the world. I
Yep.
remember actually, I don't know if it was at the event we met in Ohio, or if it was an event I did in Kansas, but I remember having a conversation of like, wow, this is really a cohesive community. They're like, well, yeah, we're in the Midwest, we have to, and
Mhm.
it's we're in danger. Even if we don't get along with each other, we have to get along with each other compared to those who would harm us outside. And I'm glad that dissolves more and more. I'm glad people feel safer and safer, although in the last 4, 6, 8 years, maybe a little less so, but I'm glad people have that safety. But with that safety, there's less of that bond, and there's less
Yes.
of that sense of we're in it together. Uh,
Yes.
I would think even in the variety of traditions in the 90s and 2000s, um, people were still looking for the heart of the mystery most of the time, not always, but most of the time. People were looking for that kind of deepening experience. They're sort of looking for the answer of, what is it? Why are we here? What are we doing? But it was very consciousness based. It was very magical mystery based. It was, I might call it today initiatory. I don't know if I would have called it that at the time. And then today I noticed there's a lot more about the separation of culture. There's a
Mm.
lot more about I am this, so I cannot be that. There's a lot more of in finding your identity, kind of creating some boxes. For
Yes.
me, I have a lot of identities, but I see them as like chords that I weave together or
Yeah.
things get synthesized together. Like I remember having this really stark conversation for me, but it was very enlightening with somebody who was asking for help, and it was an internet type of thing on social media. And I was like, oh, well, if you want to try that, this is the spell that I would do with the problem you're talking about, whatever it might be. And it involved herbs because I'm a big herb person. And she goes, oh, I can't do that. I'm a crystal witch.
Yeah.
And I
Yep.
was like, well, I use crystals too, but you can use, I said, use this crystal with these herbs. Oh, no, I can't do any herbs. I'm a crystal witch. And I was like, yeah, I don't know how to talk to you about that. And I
Right.
think it fits in other ways too. Like I think sometimes people get very hung up I'm an occultist is probably one of the words I'm very comfortable with, even though it's a
Okay.
scary for a lot of people, because I think it's the study of the secret science and there's an occulture behind things. I sometimes feel like I have more in common at times with the mystical Christian than I do with some modern witches. Um, and sometimes people will say like I will draw upon whatever is esoteric and occult and synthesize it if it speaks to me respectfully and with education and all. But I think anything that would have you persecuted as a witch is part of my world. And sometimes people will say, oh, I can only do and work in this Norse context. If that's your choice, that's fine. But if you feel this self-imposed limitation, like something else won't work for you, or you're not free enough to explore because you've chosen that identity, I think that's a problem. So I feel like there's
Yeah.
a lot of separation. You can even see it in like paganism today. Like, and I don't disagree with this, but it's an interesting way of looking at it. Like when I learned, and probably when you learned, pagan was this larger umbrella, and there was witchcraft within it. And there was
Yes.
Wiccan witches and there was non-Wiccan witches, and then there was the different traditions inside of it. And now there's witches who say, well, paganism's turning into this other thing. I'm a witch, I'm not pagan.
Right.
It's, to me, that's sort of like a Catholic saying I'm Catholic, I'm not Christian. That's, no, you're
Right.
still Christian on top of that, you know? And I think you can see the split between pagan and heathen. You can
Yep.
see there's a growing split between like practitioners in Europe who want to see themselves as practicing their indigenous religions from their culture, whether it be Greek or Eastern European or Roman or whatever it may be. There's a separation of not wanting to be associated with the occult, which is their choice, and that's fine. There was a time when I felt kinship in all those worlds. I may still feel that kinship, but I don't know if that's reciprocal.
I deeply feel that as well. I understand where you're coming from. I've got friends in all of those circles as well, but it's the individuals. I don't know if it's as much the circles,
Right.
right? And yeah, I think that's a really poignant insight about the coming together versus coming apart. And that's a huge point of why I wanted to even create this podcast, is because I remember in the 90's this big coming together. We were creating a culture together. We were creating something real together. And maybe it was new because it had never been done like that before, but we were creating something. Even us as teenagers or a little older or whatever in the 90's, we were part of something that was being created that truly ended up influencing not only wider culture in the United States, but I'd say world culture.
I
You
agree.
know, we're certainly not the only ones who ever did this or ever talked about it, but like the rise of the goddess, I would say, is definitely because of Wicca and witchcraft and paganism, and the divine feminism or divine feminine and divine feminism and all of these things, right? I think that they really all started to gain this momentum in the 90's. And I look now on Instagram and now even a little bit over on Witch Talk, goddess help us. And just on the internet in general. And there's definitely, in all of these groups, there's definitely people who are planting their flags in these camps on every single issue, right? And not even just social issue, but about what kind of spell you should be doing, what kind of magic's the most legitimate, what kind of path is the most historical, what kind of this or that, right? And um, I see it also in the wider culture that it has harmed us, and not just as witches, not just as Wiccans, not just as pagans, but also in our country. And I think we're finally now starting to realize that diversity is absolutely possible with unity at the same time. And then, as a matter of fact, we have to have some level of unity, some sort of common well that we can draw from on our various levels of who we are, in order to have a real impact, in order to shape the world in the way that actually reflects our values. Because I don't think that we're doing that as much anymore.
I agree. I think that's the, it sounds a little trite, but it's still one of my favorite things to talk about. It's the paradox of the mysteries of the age of Aquarius.
Uh-huh.
Can you be your, unique essential self, which is very Aquarian, the rebel, the individual, in the context of how do I serve the greater community? I can only
That's right.
serve the greater community by being my authentic self, but I have to have both sides of that. I can't sacrifice myself. It's very Piscean to serve the community, but I can't be so enshrining the individual that I can't then participate in community. So you've got to find the, not just even a balance point, you have to find like a synthesis of those two things. And it's hard. I totally get it's hard. I struggle with it, myself in ways, but I think, uh, and times pass, and I try to take solace in the fact of that occult maxim, dissolve and coagulate, separate
Yes.
and combine. So in these stages where I'm more uncomfortable, there's separation stages, and those are necessary. And they maybe purify and they maybe reveal the things that are underlying that I didn't want to see and we don't want to see collectively. And when we're kind of combining back together, that's where I feel like more of that community harmony, being really focusing on a community vision. But I try to take solace in the fact that it's very much a cycle.
So
And that's why
speaking of that
when I look
vision,
back at my elders in the 90's and I'm like, you were so angry and those kids get off my lawn. I was like, I get it. Like, I get it.
oh, trust me, me
And,
tue.
who's on the other side? I'm like, I have to realize like I was on the other side of that then. Who's on the other side of that now? And how do I respect their point of view as well?
Yeah, correct. And remembering that when I was young, and not everybody is necessarily 12, 13 years old, they might be a little older, but still when you're first coming into this, and especially if you are young and you're eager, there's such a passion for finding and discovering. And part of that, when we were young, as much as it is now, you're talking about Dark Willow or whatever, is that we were consuming anything we could find about witchcraft, whether it was media, and now whether it's TikTok videos or reels, or we were just consuming it and also using that a little bit as an identity framework for how we might actually be this thing. And so I'm kind of curious, with that vision you were talking about, when you were starting to publish in the early 2000s, you obviously have created the Temple of Witchcraft. So you created a structure for people to have formalized training, this unity with a lot of diversity within it. I think that really you've created something that's genius, because I think it really allows so much diversity, and yet is absolutely clear about what your commonwealths are and what you're drawing from together. And so in the late 90s, early 2000s, you're touring, you're publishing, you're speaking, you're teaching. What was your vision of witch culture 20 years from then, in 2025, 2024? What was your vision back in the early 2000s?
I don't think I had a really clear idea. I don't think I in any way would have predicted what's happened now and on multiple levels. I think I was very optimistic about the world kind of continually progressing towards more progressive inclusivity, and that, so we had some shocks going on there. I think interesting though enough, the shift of like September 11th was a huge shift that we often don't talk enough about, and even just seeing it from world point of view, but also metaphysical publishing. So when I first got involved in this, so my first book came out just before that. The first author friends that I made, the early Wiser authors and the Llewellyn authors that were big at that time, the boom post Sabrina and Buffy and all that, because they'd have their books as props in the show. So every time
Right.
people would say, oh yeah, I saw that book here, I saw that statue somebody made there, or whatever.
Absolutely. I love finding those Easter eggs. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So there was a boom in the publishing then that actually diminished after September 11th. And it was interesting talking to my, and it was, if you were in it, you didn't see it because so many more books came out, but none of those books sold really, really well. So even though, I'm getting perceived as, this bestseller in Llewellyn and everything like that, it was very different from the 90s, the mid 90s authors who pretty much did all their events for free because they made so much on the books. They'd be like, I'll fly myself out to this festival. And then, in my time, I was like, oh, I can't afford to fly myself out of this festival. If you'd like to take me out, I'll come and do your gig. And, it was a weird sense of, the relationship between speakers and authors and community, and that shifted after September 11th. And it was really interesting to watch my peers who were a bit older than me, who kind of brought me into this, be a bit upset or not understanding. They couldn't see how there was so much popularity around them, yet their books were not selling the way they were selling in 1995. And so it's interesting because I think we're in another boom now. What's a best-selling book in witch talk is not what a best-selling book was in 2005,
No.
but I think there's so many more books out there right now, and it's not, individuals have a hard time creating a legacy or creating a series or creating a body of work, because I think people just want the new quick thing that's pretty and that's a nice little hardcover with lots of photos, which is lovely. I love those books, but I think it's hard for authors to establish themselves. I see a lot of authors jumping from one publisher to the next, thinking they're going to get something, that I don't think is out there to be had. So there was that kind of shift. I looked at it like the music background, again, like, making flyers and booking gigs and traveling. I wanted to teach because I felt called. I felt by the gods to call and teach. I think if I had a choice to do something else, I probably would have. But I feel like soul level, I did not have a choice. I made a deal with one of my matron goddess Maka. And she said, if you continue to teach, you'll never have to worry about finances. Didn't say I'd be rich, said I never have to worry about finances, which has turned out to be true on that level. But I felt like that was really my calling, what I meant to do. And I feel like the types of books I write, I have to teach it for years. That's the research of it. I want to get feedback from people who are practitioners. I want to get feedback from people who are new. I want to have all the kinks worked out before I actually put it in a book. So like by the time Inner Temple came out in 2003, I'd been teaching it since 1997.
Right.
And just kind of building up each of those books and each of those levels for it. And I still try to write and teach in that same way. So you need to be kind of encountering people for that. And I sort of felt that maybe something new would be growing out of this. And so I took my time at festivals and conventions to ask other elders who've had organizations or success, what did you do that you think worked? What did you do that you think that didn't work? If you had something you could change now and go back, what would it be? Do you have any advice for me if I was to create something? What would that be? And that's sort of what got conglomerated together to be the Temple of Witchcraft. I think back in the 90s, as much as I deeply appreciate all the training I went through and loved it so much, I always wanted more.
Yes.
So like when you think of even the full, Books of Shadows from British traditional Wiccan, things like that, there's not a lot there compared to, let's say, biblical teachings or other religions,
Yeah.
And so I think we're desperately trying to gather folklore and information and mysteries, but I think it's hard to synthesize them into something. And I wanted to join something that was like a magical order that had a rich level of cohesive teachings that could kind of take me through a long-term process that, wouldn't just be kind of going here and there and everywhere. And I didn't find that. So I ended up creating that,
Yes.
So now what I wanted when I was, 22 is what I'm the head of now, or one of the founders of now. And I'm glad I'm able to pass that on to other people. We get a lot of folks who are just interested in witchcraft, and then they find us too difficult or it's a little too structured, which I totally get it. And there's a reason for that. But we often get a lot of people who've done a lot of seeking, a lot of questing, and they're just like, no, I want something that has deep roots. And that's how they end up studying with us for a long time. So I think that's the process. So that's how I use the touring and the traveling and the writing to meet people and meet community and figure out what works, what doesn't, what's needed, what do I want to take on, what do I not want to take on,
Well, it sounds to me like the Temple of Witchcraft is your vision from the late 90s, early 2000s, right? And that you did it. You made it, you created it. And one of the things I hear you saying and that I see in the temple as well that I notice has changed from the 90s was this voracious desire to learn and to train, to want to get better, to be eager to say, yes, I will spend 5 years studying with you.
Right.
Right. I mean, I spent years studying in my tradition. Yes, I had a couple different teachers, but I spent years studying in my tradition, Anderson Fairy tradition, before I got initiated. And I know that the same is true, whether it's a year and a day or whether it's 3 years until you're high priest or something like that, right? That there was a dedicated course of study. And people were hungry for that. People wanted that because, yeah, you can just pick stuff and mix it together and find out for yourself. But to me, that's no different. And that can be a lot of fun because that's no different than going in your kitchen and seeing what you can make without recipes. But it depends on how much you know about cooking. If you're not going to get a bunch of slop, if you're not going to get something that's going to stink your whole kitchen forever. But maybe if you know just enough, you could learn, you could get there. But at the same time, wouldn't it be easier just to know how much yeast goes with the flour at what temperature in the oven to make bread, as opposed to having the brick that comes out that's inedible, or the Play-Doh that just is also inedible, right? And so, and not to say that's what happens with everybody's practice, but there was, and I want to like really emphasize not just the discipline, like the Saturnian part of it, which I also do miss, quite frankly. I like sort of like a little bit more of the heaviness and the seriousness, but also the desire and joyfulness and eagerness to go through study and training like that, wanting to know. I used to tease and say that witchcraft taught me everything that I know. And it's because in order to pursue it, at least in the 90s, and you can still see this for certain practitioners now, you had to learn everything. You had to learn anthropology, you had to learn religion, you had to learn mythology, you had to learn herbology, you had to learn all sorts of things. You had sociology, you had to learn psychology, you had to learn all of these different things. And not to say you were expert in all of them, but the reading, the study was endless. And at least for me, and it sounds like for you, our teachers acknowledged that.
Yeah, it was a way of life. It wasn't just
Yeah.
take something and you're done. It was every aspect of life. Magic should influence you. I was talking to a friend, and he's talking about in his coven, the whole process, and they're just like, well, when are you not a witch? And he's like, I'm always a witch. Like that's, if you have to ask that question, I think you've sort of missed out what this is all about. It's not something you just kind of put on and take off. And I think the education's a huge part of it, and how difficult it was to get that education. Like today, there's
Yes.
often the sense of, you owe me entry into X. I found my teacher, it is you owe this, and the way that I want to be taught is the way that you have to teach me. And I mean, as an educator, you try to reach as many people, but I can't do one-on-one classes with everybody, or I can't do mentorships taking you out in the woods. I was very lucky to have that with some of my mentors, and I do that with some of my students, but you can't start there.
No.
But there's almost this sense. I remember having to go to some woman's house who I didn't know very well to learn more about Celtic witchcraft, because that's what I
right.
wanted to learn more about it. And it was that weird circuitous route of getting to some place, and you had to know the right person, you had to be there at the right time. They might just as easily turn you away and say, I'm done with that. And it was a special thing once you found somebody who'd be willing to take you on for years.
Yes.
It was, yeah, it was a different world. And I still find that today, but I think there's also a division of it today.
Yes.
I was talking to somebody who said, well, I'm a witch, and the first and foremost was the identity of the witch. And sometimes I do say witchcraft is sort of like being queer. You kind of awaken to it, or you don't awaken to it. You might have an experience that you realize, oh, this is it, or you might not ever have the experience of the words for it, but you still are. And I think that's true, but I think the inverse side of that and the difficulty of it is that then people say, well, I'm a witch and I'm interested in this. Pick whatever it is. That must be witchcraft because I'm a witch and I'm interested in it. And
Right.
like, it's not quite true either. Like, you should know a little bit more about what the roots are of what you're claiming, So it's an interesting mix these days.
I see that happening a lot too. I would agree is that I see a lot of people that actually don't really know a lot about our roots, especially our modern roots. And if they do, it tends to be either incomplete, superficial, or really damning, I would say, to some of our early people, right? There's even a really strong movement of pushing back against a lot of the people who gave their lives to bring this movement, to make us here, to create that 90s Witch podcast, right? Like they gave their lives so that we could be sitting here right now. And no one's perfect. And I think that was also kind of something that we need to remember, is that none of these people were ever supposed to be saints or gurus or holy people. That was the whole point in the craft, is that we didn't have that. Like, we weren't supposed to be perfect people, right? And so I don't feel like we ever should have put them on a pedestal quite like that to begin with. But I do find it, yeah, what were you gonna say?
It's even interesting to think about the whole self-help side of witchcraft.
Yes.
Really didn't flourish till like the late 80s. So our ancestors in the 50s and 60s, they weren't even thinking in terms of like, oh, magic's going to make me a better person. I think it does, but I don't think that was their framework. I remember someone talking about some ceremonial magicians, and they studied in the 60s with some ceremonial magicians in Britain. And they saw it as like they took their day-to-day kind of troubles and personalities off and hung it on the coat rack and did their rituals and kind of went back to their day-to-day stuff. And I get that's part of the magical personality, but they weren't really doing the magic. They were doing the magic to perceive the mysteries and experience the mysteries, but they saw that as separate from their day-to-day work and their family life and everything. It really wasn't until the 80s and then beyond when we started thinking much more in terms of psychology and magic, and some more of the feminist and social justice kind of stuff kind of came in the 80s, environmental stuff, that we started thinking about, how does this make us better as people? How do we heal? Like today, people are talking about shadow work all the time. I remember when I wrote, Shamanic Witchcraft, Temple of Shamanic Witchcraft, and talked about shadow work, people were like, oh, can you talk about that? Like, is that safe? Is that, and I was like, well, there's a whole program for how I take people through it. If you follow the program, I wouldn't say it's safe, but it's not unsafe. It's got a protocol to it. But it wasn't, people weren't thinking in those terms, even though it's underlies the whole tradition. You can see why Jung went to alchemy and occultism to describe psychology. And you can see a lot of that in the initiation ceremonies of British traditional Wicca.
Absolutely.
But people weren't articulating it till the 80s. So there wasn't really even that expectation that you had to be better.
That's fascinating too, right? It's sort of there wasn't as much of that moral component, I guess you could say.
Yeah, or even just self-development, or, now we talk a lot about evolution and spiritual evolution. And I think there was always entry into the mysteries, but I don't know if people used it quite the way we do it today, or even how we were using it in the 90s. I think we had the benefit of the 90s from those who came from the 70s and 80s, who started thinking about, well, how does this affect me as a person? How does this affect me as a citizen of the world? How does this affect me and my family?
In Michael Howard's, I think it's called History of Wicca, he talks about that as well, with the evolution of Wicca turning into an earth religion, and how originally it wasn't considered nature oriented per se, it was mystery oriented. And that's not to say that it got off track or anything. I'm not trying to say that anything wrong happened, as much as just to emphasize your point that people were thinking in a whole different context even back then, and that this was actually a secret society, right? It was actually a secret society. Um,
I remember back in the 90s, you test the waters with somebody and be like, if they sneezed, you'd say, "Goddess bless you," and see how they responded to that, or you
yep.
might throw in a blessed be just to see, if they like look at you, or you look at their jewelry and be like, "Oh, is that a star?" My mom
Yep.
would wear this tiny, tiny gold pentacle, and everyone thought she was Jewish. They didn't
Oh,
look
that
for.
happened to me all the time. I was always afraid that people, when I first started doing it, I was like, oh, I was all prepared for someone to ask me if I was a Satanist. And that didn't happen once, but I can't count the number of times I didn't know you were Jewish. And I was like, I didn't know you couldn't count. Right. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So, Christopher, who would you say? I know you talked about Lori and some of your early mentors, but did you have any sort of like witchcraft heroes from the 90's? Was there anybody that really inspired you as you were growing as a witch?
Well, I would say the one that evolved into a really good friendship was Raven Grimassi.
Oh, yes,
So
Raven.
yeah, so Laurie Cappett's teachings were all very Celtic oriented. So once I finished studies with there, the first really serious book I dug into was his Ways of the Strega, and it got
Hmm.
renamed Italian Witchcraft. And my mom was really into it because our heritage, my mother's side of the family is all Italian. So like learning the folk magic and the context of witchcraft, and he couched it in occultism so we could understand it. It wasn't just a folkloric tradition from Italy. And it was just really fascinating to read. And so my mom started adapting more of that. That was really when I was first introduced to Aradia, Gospel of the Witches, and that whole mythology. And, looking at that, we started including a little bits of that into the rituals we did. And you could see how Doreen Valente was influenced by it from, the Charge of the Goddess and things like that. So it was just started getting me digging more. I think I went through that initial training. Now I'm like, okay, where did this come from? And where did this come from? And who's that? And so Raven really kind of introduced me to a lot of figures that were different from who Laurie introduced me to, and a lot of
Yeah.
teachers that were different from that. And then he was touring for the Witch's Craft, I think it was either 98 or 99, somewhere around there. And he came by locally, and we got our book signed. I got a chance to meet him. And at that point, I think I had signed with Weiser, was just about to sign with Weiser. And so we got to chatting. And then my very first big kind of event I want to say it was in Denver, Colorado. It was the International New Age Trade Show.
Hmm.
And so I got picked up in the van from the airport, and Raven and Stephanie were in the van as well. So it's like, oh, hey, I don't know if you remember me, but, and we got chatting, and we did a number of kind of author business events. And a lot of the authors got to have dinner together with the publishers and things like that. I got to spend some time with them. And then on my first really big book tour, I ended in San Diego, and I got to spend a couple of evenings with them at their house, and stayed with them before I left, and really kind of bonded, and I got to go through the whole kind of fanboy, oh my God, I'm with Raven Grimassi. But at the same time, really got to understand where he's coming from and what his life was like. And just as we were talking about things in the 90's, he was sharing things about the 60s and 70s and the weird ways you'd meet elders there, and how he was trained and what his family was like kind of growing up in sort of a witchcraft family. So I feel very privileged that I had a really close relationship with him. And he and Stephanie moved out to New England a number of years ago, and he's since passed. But I'm still very close with Stephanie, and I got really a good chance to see them quite regularly when they're out here. And we did a lot of events together and did a lot of travel together. So it was weird to kind of turn that fanboy moment into something that became a really true and lasting friendship. Even on the other side, he still comes to visit.
Well, I can definitely tell you that I felt that way when I knew I was going to first meet you in 2007, because our mutual friends are like, oh, yeah, Christopher's coming. He's going to hang out with us. I was like, Christopher Penczak's going to be hanging out with us. So I definitely felt that as well. I understand that feeling, and how fortunate, I guess this applies to me now too, because I was going to say how fortunate it is to meet some of your quote unquote heroes and not have them horribly disappoint you. Right. Because I think we've also both had that experience happen
Yeah.
on a number of occasions. Right. So how fortunate, that's really a blessing to have that happen like that.
And I think we both met Margot Adler at the same time.
I think we did. I think you're right.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think you're right. Yeah. Same tea party. Yeah. Yeah. Once upon a time.
Yeah. Yes.
So, Christopher, I'm kind of curious. I also like to ask people if there's anything, whether it's like realistic or not, if there's anything from the 90s you wish you could somehow just pick up and give to 2024.
Hmm.
What would that be? It could be a quality, it could be anything that you think was present in the witch culture of the 90s that we're either missing today or you wish was still present.
The virtue of silence and privacy.
Say it again. Right. Yeah.
Silence and privacy. So like even I'm even thinking about like your internet question, the difference between a Yahoo group and a Facebook post or even a Facebook group. There was a
So
level of
true.
intimacy in that group because you knew what was in that group was not going to be shared with anybody else. Where now there's screen captures and you have to be very careful even if you're saying something in a private group of what's shared and what's not shared or and just the nature of everything is so public right now. I think there's a power to letting things kind of be in the quiet and being in stillness and being in darkness and sharing things with only a few intimate people to not have to share every spell and every ritual and every place you go and every person you meet with the whole world. I think I struggle with that still myself today. Like I don't, when I travel, I post the pictures days later because I feel like I need some space and process in it before everybody else comments on it. And I don't post really much of anything of my actual personal practice. I'll share things and I'll share what's going on in our community. But I think there's a virtue of that kind of that athanor of letting things kind of distill in darkness and heat and not let out the steam by letting everybody into it. I think that's a
Oh,
blessing.
I love that answer. I love that answer. I think that that is touching on something so powerful for witches, witch culture, for magical workers, and even just for us as human beings in 2024. Because on one level, whether we've agreed to or not, we have all been forced into being our own brand managers of our lives.
Right. Right. Yeah, I encourage people, I don't know if this is from the 90s ethos or not, but I encourage people to break that mindset. You are not a brand, you are not a product, your magic is not a product. If you want to share things artistically because it makes you feel good, if it's a part of your practice, if it's a part of your business, it's a part of my business, and I get the irony and difficulty of that. So
Yes.
don't feel like don't reduce yourself to a commodity and don't reduce magic to consumption. Share,
Yes.
share, but don't get lost in it. I see a lot
This
of
might
people
be
lost.
this might be a big response to that, but I have been thinking about this a lot in terms of a number of things we've touched on in this conversation, from shops to what you're speaking to now, and how our movement was different in the 90s. Is that we had like this stratified layer of our movement, which was on the base was commerce. It always was commerce. It was shops. It was Azure Green. It was festivals, it was publishing, it was something like the base was commerce because that's how material things got produced and shared. That makes sense. We have to have it. But commerce was the foundation for community on top of it. And that was the focus, right? All of that was just to create a platform for community. And that was really what the focus was. And then once there was enough community, we then start to do religious co-creation together. And so, and what I feel like now, and this isn't a perfect sociological, anthropological diagram, but the way I'm thinking about it is now it feels to me like those two top layers have been like removed and put in different areas. And we're pretty much left with the only thing we connect around is commerce.
Right.
And I think what you're also talking about with silence, it's not even just always keep it to yourself. It's what happens when you are in intimate community and it stays there. And that's all that it is. It's not for the public. And that's not because you're hiding anything necessarily. What was happening in those shops, that wasn't for the public. As much as they had open rituals and open circles and classes and everything else, the public didn't go there. It wasn't for the public. It was for people who belong there.
And just the magic that could happen in those containers. Not that it's still not happening now, but I think it's weird to see a post where someone shares something about a circle and like, and someone had this great breakthrough of, whatever, because of the teachings, the rituals I did. That's nobody's business. I think you can say, hey, we celebrated Lammas tonight, or we did a full moon, or whatever, but it gets weird. I've been to many public circles where amazing magic has happened, and that stays there. And people's breakthroughs and people's healings and people's breakdowns and everything in between stayed there.
Yeah.
And I think that's a tough thing. I think you're right about the kind of religious co-creation and the community sides kind of get separate. I think you can have online community. One of the
I
crazy
agree.
things we've learned from our great pause of times is that how many we had, because we do a correspondence course of our school, we had so many distant members who didn't have a local branch near them. And so we started doing visionary Sabbats. So, I have a hard time with online ritual if you're just going to watch somebody do a ritual, but I'm good in leading a guided kind of astral travel journey to us all to a similar place to have an experience together. And so we started doing that for Sabbats for the distant community. And we have an in-person festival, and we have a lot of people who just for a variety of reasons can't travel. So we've done an online festival. So I think those things can still kind of intersect, but it's interesting. I shudder sometimes by looking at, I feel like sometimes the world is reduced to all of us making commercials for ourselves, about
100%.
ourselves, for corporations to keep running. They're not even
100%. And that's the opposite of what witchcraft is supposed to be about.
right. Exactly.
At least in my view. And that doesn't mean that people obviously can't charge, create institutions. I'm also for all of those things, but that also doesn't mean that it's just consumerism or commerce or marketing.
Right. I know there's a psychology to marketing because I've had enough in the music
Absolutely, yes.
with this, but I do shudder when I see peers and contemporaries of mine be like, these are the 3 things you need to know about witchcraft, or these are the 6 things you've done wrong in your spell. Like, that turns me off completely. If you want to share something heartfelt, I would love to hear it. If you want to write something heartfelt, I'd love to read it. If you want to share something beautiful, if you want to create a reel, you want to create a video of something, it's something that's inspiring. But it's that weird jargon to hook people. I wrote recently about how we give our attention to people, but I feel like a lot of the world is about hooking people to keep their attention. And as an occultist, as someone interested in consciousness, that bothers me because I don't think I should have too much of your attention. I think you should have your attention. I should have my own attention. Like if I inspire you or you inspire me, I think that's great. But I think to hook people just to hook people, it's a tough world. And I get that's the world we live in right now, and that's the culture, but I'd like to see a shift again. Who would have thought in 10 years, 15 years, we'd be where we are now. So in 15 years, we could be someplace very different too. I think we just have to start thinking about what those engagements and interactions are like, because the way it is now is not super helpful for me.
I am also sensing at least the beginning, I think, of a pendulum shift around this too. The fact that now there has been so much growth. There are so many more niche communities that now I think that there is a desire for something that's happening together, right? I think that there's starting to be a desire for specialization and going deeper because now it's just everywhere, right? And so it's so easy. I've mentioned in other talks that I've done here on the podcast and I share with friends, right? But like whole other world when you can walk into Barnes and Noble and the very first, or not Barnes and Noble anymore. It is Barnes and Noble, but you walk in that very first opening area and it's practically its own occult shop, right? It's like, here's your witchcraft kit, your astrology kit, your palmistry kit, and you haven't even gotten through the main doors yet, right? And so and so that also leads me to my next question. We just talked about what you'd love to bring from the 90s to now, but is there anything about witch culture now that you like better in the 90s or that you're glad we've developed?
That's a great question. I would say probably the ease of communication. I think as much as I do like going to things that are in person, to not have to always drive 3 hours to get someplace and to, meet the other witches. I love the idea, some of the online communication, when you can manage it and when you can be private. Like, I love that I'm part of a worldwide temple. And I love that we have ministers in Sweden and we've got students in Italy and Greece and South America. And I get to visit with all those people and talk with them and learn from them. I think that's amazing. I think that was harder to do in the 90s, even with our Yahoo groups and everything like that. I wasn't encountering the internationality of it all.
Right.
Yes, that I think is really a beautiful aspect of what's going on right now. I love the level of information that we have, the diversity of information. Like, it's overwhelming sometimes. And I can't, people like, oh, how can you not have read the latest hot witchcraft book that has just come out? Well, I'm into weird niche things now. And there's so many little niche publishers, and there's beautiful hardcover books, and there's all sorts of
Mm.
grimoires, like modern grimoires that are being put out, So I love the diversity of material. We just came back from London, and I got to visit my favorite shop in the whole world, Atlantis Books,
Oh,
and
yes.
a ton of books there that you don't see in America. And I'm sure I could find them online, but I don't know to look for them online. So
Hmm.
having that shop and being like, oh, there's these, 4 hardcover books from a publisher I've never heard of before. I'm going to snatch those up. And, all of that, I think the level of technology to allow the freedom of publishing, even for myself. So I went from Wiser to Llewellyn to now Copper Cauldron. I realized that my writing was taking to a point where it's too complex and too dense and too specific that it's not going to be a Llewellyn bestseller. And rather than have the fight, my last book with Llewellyn, we had a bit of a to-do where, they were just like, this last chapter is not you, it should be this. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? And they couldn't articulate it, but it was very mystical. So the mystical part of the book that I liked the most, they were like, oh yeah, our readers aren't going to get that. And I was like, oh yeah, because your readers aren't going to get where I'm going in my life. I have to get out. And
Mm.
even, there's the struggle with Llewellyn. I'm very grateful for everything they've done, and they treated me really well. And despite a lot of the 90's and early 2000s critiques of Llewellyn and they're this and they're that, they treated me incredibly well. And I worked with some really amazing people until I changed. So I get, it was
Yeah.
up on me, and the books that I wanted to do were different. But I didn't want to be mad all the time. I didn't want to be struggling because, I was not getting the level of attention because I wasn't writing the 101 book that everybody could buy. I was writing the 302 book that nobody wanted to buy unless you've read the other books. And that's what I wanted to write. So I knew I had to
Yeah.
kind of get out of there and create a system. And I love about our modern technology of print on demand and all these other options. Like, I can sell 1,000 books through Copper Cauldron, and I make the same money if I sold 10,000 through Llewellyn.
Right.
So I don't have the pressure to have to make this be a hit. I don't constantly always have to be going on, you need this witchcraft book, because I don't think the books I'm writing you need. I think if you want them, if you're interested in them, that's great. And I think they're there for you, and they'll be there for you later on if it's not the right time. But the pressure that a lot of authors have right now, I'm glad I've been relieved of it, because I can do what I want in my own space. And I think the technology of our times allows that in a way that didn't 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
Absolutely. And I just want to make a note here, just in case anybody doesn't know, that Copper Cauldron is your own publishing house, correct?
Yes. Yeah. So originally we had a vision of having the Temple of Witchcraft have its own publishing house, but in the infinite wisdom of the IRS, because I had success outside of it, if I was nobody starting the Temple of Witchcraft, we probably could have done it. But there was that concern that I was trying to create a shell corporation to, right, to not have to pay taxes on things. So they insisted that we separate the publishing company out. So that's how Copper Cauldron was born.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I just wanted everybody to know so that you can go look for Copper Cauldron if you want to go find some of Christopher's later work and how everything has developed. But Christopher, is there anything else that you'd like to share with that 90s witch in our audience about your experience, or anything that maybe comes up for you when you look back at the 90s and see your journey?
When I look back on it, I have to say I'm very blessed. I feel very fortunate to have come in when I did. I love the arc of how it all unfolded for me. And I love that I kind of came in that time of somewhat secret society and somewhat, you know, mouth to ear teachings. And, you had to come to a coven and know the right person. I'm glad that it's much more open for people who are seekers, because there's so many more seekers. But I'm glad I got a little of that bridge. It wasn't the way it was in the 60s, but I got a little taste of that. I got a little bridge of that world. And I just guess I would encourage people, if they want to take something from the 90s into today's practices for them, is to always look for that mystery.
Yes.
Always talk to the person who you might not always talk to, because sometimes the wisest person in those shops was the little old lady sitting in the rocking chair in the corner, not talking unless you talk to her, And there's great wisdom to be found by talking to the unusual person who's not saying on social media, look at me, look at me, look at me. But they're just kind of
Absolutely.
quietly still and silent. And if you talk with them, they could reveal great gems. So I'd say look for the quiet, wise person in the corner and see what they might have to say.
I love that. Christopher, thank you so much for joining me here, and thank you so much for sharing your story and your experience. And the witch world is so lucky to have you and to have the Temple of Witchcraft. I'm glad that I feel comforted too to know that your legacy will continue on with the Temple of Witchcraft, and that witch culture, however it's going to be in the next 10, 20 years, you're going to help to shape that in some way. And I'm glad.
That actually is a big part of the 90s that I would say all the places that I learned and all the shops and things, they're all gone now. So part of the Temple of Witchcraft was trying to create something that wasn't dependent upon one person.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yes.
a little reminder. Thank you so much for having me on. I had a really great time. It was super special and great walk down memory lane. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, we'll have you on again sometime.
That'd be awesome. Thank you.